welcome along. We begin, so Ninamani, Ghana for hello. Welcome. We begin by acknowledging that we meet on the lands, the unceded lands of Australia's First Nations peoples, and I acknowledge that I live, work and present to you today from the unceded lands of the Ghana people of the Adelaide Plains, and pay respects to elders past or present, acknowledge that land was never ceded, and call for an Indigenous voice to Parliament. And I acknowledge that we meet on a range of different lands, and so we invite you to acknowledge the lands that you're living and working on in the chat, if that is available to us in this format. I'm not sure. Yeah. Over to you, Justin.
Yes, thank you. So as you will all know, there's three of us speaking tonight. That was Tully Barnett from Flinders University, and we've got Dan Hill from Melbourne University, sitting on Melbourne University land at the moment, I think, and myself, Justin O'Connor. And we're going to talk about culture as infrastructure, and that will take an hour or 55 minutes as we've got now. I'll speak first, just put some general framework there, followed by Dan Hill, who will talk about culture as infrastructure, as we see, and then followed at the end by Tully. And we'll try and stick to 15 minutes each, so we'll have a bit of chance for discussion as we go before we end at 6 o'clock. Well, I'm going to speak a bit here tonight because two of us, Tully and myself, will be going off to Europe in 2 days, and hopefully, and we're going to spend about 3 weeks talking to various people obviously in Europe, but a range of international agencies, including the EU, and participate in quite a number of discussions with UNESCO. And the reason for that is that in September, UNESCO is running a kind of a very big conference, Mondial Cult 22, in Mexico City, and it's celebrating 40 years of culture and development. And I say 40 years because it's looking back to Mexico 1982, when they launched their big conference on cultural policies for development, in which they expanded the idea of culture away from arts or beyond arts, and suggested that development and culture without each other make no sense. And I wanted to start there because if I can, wanted to point that because it's a moment of reflection for UNESCO, but also for the United Nations generally. And I was very interested in reading their declaration. You heard it first from me. It's actually advance of the declaration, but anyway. And they say something really interesting. They say contemporary global landscape is marked by multiple, protracted and multidimensional crises, linked in particular to the dramatic consequences of climate change and biodiversity, armed conflict, natural hazards, uncontrolled urbanization, unsustainable development patterns, as well as the erosion of democratic societies, which lead in particular to an increase in poverty, inequalities in the exercise of rights, and a growing divide in access to digital technologies. And followed by that, they say, these challenges call more than ever for reinvesting in the transformative role of culture in public policies and for the full exercise of fundamental human rights, which is quite a declaration for UNESCO, and it as befits a kind of 40 years after the first attempt to define the relations. But I want to suggest that there's a lot of problems with this regarding cultural policy, and this is what we'll talk a bit about today, about how to, in many respects, but certainly me and Tully, how cultural policy is an attempt to realign itself with some broader currents of public policy. But I want to talk about some of the difficulties it must overcome in order to do that. So the United Nations have just published this, not just, earlier this year, published their new Our Common Agenda, which is looking forward to next year's big summit on the future. And again, the United Nations see us at an epochal moment when, if you like, they don't ever say this, but basically the ideas of the Washington Consensus, the ideas that have dominated development, certainly since the early 1990s, have kind of are over, and a new kind of much more volatile situation is facing us, as we know from what I've just said in that declaration. This is their common agenda. It's very small, not even I can read it, and I'm looking at the screen. But basically, it's things like leave no one behind, it's about gender equality, it's about sustainable development in general. It does not mention culture anywhere. So this is their big push, and yet culture is out of it. And of course, we knew that because in 2015, after lots of horse trading, culture never made it to the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals, an update of the Millennium Development Goals, an attempt to really turn development into some kind of holistic approach and set some key indicators. Culture's disappeared from it. And that to me is quite indicative of the status of culture in public policy, which is basically almost negligible. Now, we'll come back to this at the end when Tully's going to talk about this in some more detail. But there's been a range of new approaches to development and socio-economic, holistic social development in an age of climate change. Kate Raworth, perhaps one of the more famous, it's a New York Times bestseller, in which she attempts to link the social foundations, which are basically the SDGs around energy, housing, essential infrastructure, education, health, etc. That these social foundations must be secured within the ecological ceiling of the planet. Hence the donut, the space between where we can't fall below and the space where we cannot go above if we're going to live on a sustainable planet. So this has, of course, been met by a whole range of new developments, or not new developments, I would say, mainstream adoptions of that we need to fundamentally change the system if we are to live on a sustainable planet. This was the director of KPMG redoing the figures on the Committee of Rome's limits to growth from 1972, where she finds that yes, unless we change, the Earth is not sustainable. We've got all the various Green New Deals that are coming in, however they finally managed to come out, but obviously in America, in the EU, we've got them coming out in China in different kinds of ways. We've got to move away from the small state model of development. People like Mariana Mazzucato's talking about entrepreneurial states, mission economies, in which the state takes a lead, as opposed to, the state should just get out of the way of the market. We've got new models of international development, whether they're kind of Wall Street rendered or whether they're more green, if you like, but both of them are about investing not in industrial growth, but in health, education, and infrastructure. We've got obviously a whole range of new economic kind of movements, pretty mainstream, pretty standard, although they don't yet make it to the ABC, obviously. But New Economy Network is one of them. Circular economies, got a whole range of new thinking about new economies, which I won't dwell on there. Got the range of return of macroeconomics after it was pronounced dead by neoliberalism. And, we've got mainstream things like this. I picked this out from a few months back, John Quiggin saying we renationalise energy. I mean, incredible for somebody to be taken seriously saying that. Even 3 or 4 years ago, it wouldn't get a look at it. So we've got this new kind of scenario here from the global to the local. Where's culture in this? And what's clear to us, and many of us working in the Reset Collective, which I'll talk a bit about later, culture does not appear here. 2 books, one example, John Roscano, who was in the Jobs and Skills Summit, talks about how do we reset Australia. Culture's not mentioned. Jess Scully, some great ideas for new forms of participatory democracy, new forms of economic growth, new forms of collective economies. No mention of culture, and she's a creator herself. So this is a long way away from going back to 1949, T.H. Marshall talking about social citizenship, the United Nations Universal Declaration, talking about everyone having the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts and to share in the in scientific advancement and its benefits. This was taken as standard, and yet the discourse at the moment, both mainstream and, if you like, alternative, barely mentions culture. And I think that's a problem. And I think what we wanted to talk about, what I've been talking about recently, is the role of creative economy within this. And I'm not going to go into any detail, but certainly for the last 20 years, the cultural sector in all its manifestations have led with its economic dimension. And I don't just mean economic impact, but the idea that culture is somehow part of the industry of the future. It's part of a high growth, even high tech industry that's actually that's about the mobilization of creativity, which, of course, as we all know, is going to lead on to the next industrial revolution. From agriculture through industry, through services, we're now in the creative economy 4.0, whatever you want to call it. And I suggest this has really prevented culture from being taken seriously as part of the transformative agenda. Creative economy, okay, the idea was it was a Trojan horse. Somehow present ourselves as economy, and culture moves to the top table. How can they possibly argue with 14.5 growth rates, or 111 billion contribution to GDP? How could they argue with that? We're bound to be taken seriously. And I would say quite boldly, culture has not been taken seriously. We see it in cultural budgets, which have been slashed mostly. Some countries are standing out, but globally they've really been slashed. We've seen the creative work, the conditions of creative workers, their incomes plummet. And there's a real idea that there's been a mass deprofessionalization of the cultural sector that was in process before the pandemic. And so we just see the progressive marginalization of the cultural sector from any form of public policy debate. It doesn't get a look in, really. So, and previously, previous conventions, such as the 2005 convention, sought to distinguish between economic and cultural value to assert the primacy of culture. But the creative economy argued that it's a benign economy. It's a good economy in itself. It's using creativity. It produces good jobs. It produces externalities, skills and knowledge and social trust, which is, what's good for the economy is good for culture and vice versa. It was a win-win scenario. And to cut a long story short, it led to an uncritical boosterism of the creative economy and a lot of really bad research, which I won't name names. And fundamentally, it was a depoliticization. We've got, and I use Will Davis's notion in his, I think, 2015 book, neoliberalism as the disenchantment of politics by economics. And if ever that expressed anything, it's on what's happened to culture, where any critical view of the cultural market, if you like, the creative economy as market, is out the door. More disturbingly, what this ignores, this absolute kind of bowing down to the power of economics or the power of new numbers, is that markets are a cultural policy. As this is Davis, the economy is cultural. And he talks about cultural political economy being more valuable than ever if it can illuminate the ways in which markets, property rights, work and consumption produce distinctive identities and affects, not as side effects, but as integral components of how they operate. And so the shift of creative economy from, if you like, a cultural politics to a cultural economics actually is a cultural policy, but it doesn't, of course, it depoliticized policy. The language of itself is debilitating, and I won't go into this too much detail, but David Throsby a few years ago, talking about why culture did not get into the SDGs, is that economics can't deal with intergenerational equity. It's an efficiency question about optimal strategies for intertemporal resource allocation. It's merely a moral or an ethical issue. It's subjective, and therefore it can't be involved in economic calculus, and therefore we don't talk about it. It's this kind of language that's really deeply embedded now in our understanding of culture, where the culture and economic have been almost melded together in that way. And of course, culture can speak about intergenerational equity. If, culture's one of its most foundational definitions is its ability to connect past and future. Burke's contract between those who are dead, those who are living, and those who are to be born. That's what culture is in large part. And yet it's excluded from the discussions on intergenerational equity in that way. So our work at the Reset Collective being based somewhat around this. How do we get culture back into the social foundations? How do we get it alongside health, education, social services, essential infrastructure? How is culture to become part of those social foundations? So social infrastructure, and it's kind of leading on to Dan because he's going to talk about infrastructure. This is our attempt to kind of show how culture is distributed across the foundational economy. I won't go into that in any detail. But just to finish on the slide, which says why this is important, and I was talking to Hans Momas a few months ago, and he wrote quite an interesting mail, and he said, I never deal, as the head of the Environmental Assessment Agency, I never deal with culture. We never come across culture. They're just not at the table. And he says, there's no clear place or storyline for the role of culture in the sense of creating and celebrating collective forms of imagination, communication, perspectives. He says we need a rich cultural sphere in itself for culture to be even instrumental to these other agendas. Why not start with redeveloping the storyline that in the midst of the crises we find ourselves in, we urgently need a revival of a cultural sphere, and that the current lack of this has been a big mistake, because it's producing a distrust in the future and a lack of collective imagination. Well, I think that's definitely where we are. And so what I wanted to end it on saying is, culture is out of many discussions about the social transformation, the necessary transformation we need to undertake. But its absence from this, I think, is debilitating for that project. We need culture in. It's not the only answer, but without culture, our solutions to the problems that are facing us are going to be much worse. So again, culture is part of the social foundations, and without culture finding that its role again, I think we're going to be faced with increased peripheralization and a diminution of the effect of culture, transformation agenda. Okay, sorry, I'm going to end there and pass over. Right, so where are we? Okay. So I want to pass over now to Dan Hill, acting now as a chair, and Dan's head of School of Design at Melbourne University, as you all know, and he's going to pick up on some of he's going to talk about his own work, kind of not coming from opposite directions, but coming from perhaps a parallel direction, and how these might intersect with our ideas of culture as infrastructure. So over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Justin. Can you see my slides?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That was great, and I will do my best to pick up the baton and run with it a bit. So yeah, as Justin said, I'm at the Melbourne School of Design, which is the graduate school in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning at Melbourne Uni. And so we're concerning with things like this, this big old mess you see in the background there, which is Melbourne, but I'll point you to the quote by Peter Conrad from a long time ago at the top. The city is a built dream, a vision incarnated. What makes it grow is its image of itself. So he immediately places the idea of cities growing and what cities are about in this cultural mode, or the cultural imagination that Justin was talking about. And to some extent, I'm using this picture of Melbourne to show that that's Melbourne, I think, believing that it's New York or Manhattan in some way. And Melbourne is more than that and different to that, but you can see this is some strange planning minister's idea of what a Melbourne might be in his imagination, at least. The other quote there is from Raymond Williams from even longer ago, just pointing out again this sense that what we do is essentially a kind of art. We see the creation of the world as a form of art and has the same kind of constituent dynamics and elements like learning, description, and communication, and so on. So I won't read all of this out, but just to pick out these kinds of words, the city has not been managed in that way, however, from a policy point of view, if you like, planning, architecture, urbanism. It's really been a question of extracting capital from the city. I don't need to point this out to you, I imagine, and that's what its supporting infrastructures have been oriented around. And as Justin said, we can also see arts and culture has been reframed in the same way as an industry, and that they're both a dead end, because the city is more than that, just as culture is. So how do we reposition this interplay between the infrastructure? And infrastructure is an interesting word because it sounds important, and it is important. And so it's this sort of the supporting structures, if you like, the structures beneath things, that's what the word means, that enables us to live. So it's foundational, to pick up again one of Justin's point, and then understand how that links to arts and culture, which is, you'll see in a minute, I use Brian Eno's understanding of that as everything we don't have to do, and yet we do. So it's central and fundamental to our patterns of living. How do those two things connected, this kind of background and foreground? So infrastructure is interesting in that sense. These are a couple of quotes about infrastructure from Susan Lee Starr, who talks about this kind of exquisitely boring character that it has, which I really like as a exquisitely boring is somehow capturing this sort of weird dynamic or tension between these things. It's boring and exquisite at the same time. And then Keller Easterling, an urban designer who talks about infrastructure being the overt point of contact and access between us all. It's not really, it is sort of the background. But as you understand, when she extends that to transportation and communication and utilities, it's so fundamentally important that it also directs the foreground. And this is where Eno's quote comes in, and I'm choosing this picture of Eno from, I think, 1972, because he looks like he's wearing a Melbourne mullet on his head. But it says art is everything that you don't have to do. And he just talks about, for instance, what we have to eat, but we don't have to invent baked Alaskas or sausage rolls or Heston Blumenthal. Humans, strangely, make it into this complicated, embellished, stylish activity of some kind. So that's what we produce from an apparently basic thing, a basic infrastructure, like the requirement of eating or nourishment in this way. He talks about fashion in the same way. Obviously, we have to clothe ourselves, but we don't have to invent Chanel black dresses and things, but we do. Oops, wrong way. So this is, now, sadly. He also points out, while we don't have to do it, we sort of do it. So again, he's also on this kind of tension, this kind of exquisite, boring thing. Art and culture is, in fact, in the same speech, he says, the central thing that we do. And I think, again, that this is part of why we produce cities, not to make buildings or to make infrastructure or to make data or whatever. We make cities to produce culture and conviviality and community, these kinds of things. That's what they're about, in fact, and infrastructure enables us to get there. So why architecture and design and urbanism is the lens from my point of view? I borrow another quote from a colleague of mine, Kieran Long at ArchDes in Sweden. He says it's architecture and design's task to give form to a societal idea like justice through the creation of a setting for people to encounter that idea, like a courthouse. So he says that it's the way that we define our public buildings and spaces, our infrastructure, speaks to what we're about. They speak to what we are made of, if you like, or what we believe or what we stand for. So again, they are cultural, imaginative acts at the same time as being a metro station or a bus stop. And again, it's this kind of fascinating tension that is interesting to us from our school, at least. So this is a project I led in Sweden, working with Kieran and others when I was working in the Swedish government, just looking at how do you transform streets into places for experimentation, for cultural, for play, for circular economy at the same time. This is all Swedish timber, and it's fixing bits of transport and so on, as well as creating public and shared spaces. So it's a sort of infrastructure for culture. And underneath that, we looked at then the value of those things. Now, this is where this is a kind of a tension back to the room, or a question at least. We did start tracking a lot of the value here in terms of that which can be counted, but we at least tried to make it not necessarily quantifiable in a traditional sense. If you've been following the debate around the Green Line in the paper in Melbourne over the weekend, this new bit of infrastructure where a business case has been produced, and apparently it will create something like 4,000 jobs or $400 million worth of something or other. So there's a financial case done for really actually what is a wetlands floating down on the Yarra. What we're trying to do with this work is say, well, finance, fine, that's something you can count, but there are many, many other things you can also put into that kind of reckoning. And so this was what we call the value model, and this work is ongoing in Sweden now, looking at, if you reduce road traffic noise in the streets, you increase birdsong. If you increase birdsong, you increase people's mental health. If you do that, you can, you also recover from sickness quicker and so on. So these are things that can be quantified and not necessarily financialized. You can pull out financial impact of that, but it's also much broader than that. And it immediately asks the question also, but what is the value of birdsong intrinsically on its own terms, if you like? That's something we're just not used to doing from a policy-making point of view. You can imagine transport planners do not have that data in their hands when they're thinking about designing streets. So it's partly why when we did the streets project in Sweden, we pulled in Brian Eno to work on the design principles for us. So we had the voice of at least one artist and musician alongside the transport planners when framing what the streets are about. To some extent, this is broadening the playing field, if you like, not necessarily leveling it, but like at least broadening it out to bring arts and culture into as a valid voice for thinking about how you might design streets. Without that, the streets are designed with sort of a very simple equation of, X thousand cars per hour, hoping to avoid Y number of deaths. It's that kind of very crude mechanisms. Similarly, with the European Bauhaus project, which we intervened with in Sweden, which is a major European Commission initiative, we managed to get 11 different creative teams, artists, architects, and designers working with municipalities in 5 cities in the north of Sweden. Coming out of that, just to give you a glimpse of it, here's some of the early work coming from those processes. But that first sentence there, we urge Umeå to stop and reflect and be radical enough to formulate quality goals instead of quantity goals. So this is kind of the very, this isn't the urban plan, that's a separate process, but this is an intervention into it, using the Bauhaus as an excuse to start a discussion about what would it mean to talk about quality, not quantity, or as it says in the bottom line here, radical grassroots opportunities, preserve and building qualities, soul and peculiarities. I mean, these are just really lovely words. Strangely Google translated from Swedish, so I might not be getting them exactly accurate, but they're close enough. And even if they're not, isn't it nice to think that there might be soul and peculiarities being, on the table at least now in terms of thinking about the future of the town of Umeå. So this question, how should we quantify that we can quantify, but at least do it more broadly, talk about the health benefits of birdsong, for instance? Or is that dangerous even to go down that route of trying to quantify something unquantifiable like birdsong, which is clearly more than just having a health impact. It also has an intrinsic quality, you could argue. But equally, how do we talk about these kind of qualities? Can we qualify through ongoing engagement and cooperation with the rest of the stuff, as in everything else that can't be quantified quite so neatly? So that leads to this kind of idea of what I call this 1-minute city of the street, in the Swedish stuff at least, about changing the way we think about them, not as fire and forget things being managed through reports and quantities and quantifiable, almost engineering metrics, but things that you're actually engaged with on the street of municipalities. And that's a very different approach, as Nikita Oliver, the Black Lives Matter activist, mayoral candidate in Seattle, pointed out. This is really hard, taking something that works for the community over time. It's actually relatively straightforward to stop and do a pop-up, but to figure out what it is ongoing, that takes a different level of commitment, entirely different qualities, different skill sets that you don't find in municipalities. I've started sketching that out in these kinds of interplays between participative cultures of decision-making at the small scale, if you like, the 1-minute city. You could take a shared garden and work that through on the street with neighbors there, all the way through to the 60-minute city or beyond, the larger scale systems like wetlands or the Murray-Darling, if you like, which you can't work through in a participative way. It has to be representative, probably in some mode. So there's a kind of series of different types of democracy at play here up and down these scales, and interesting kind of crossover points. This is very sketchy thinking by me, but thinking about this different kind of cultures of decision making, which leads to this, and I'll race through this, but this social and cultural infrastructures that Justin brought in, and this is our list of his list that we did with students in Oslo, just looking at the kinds of things you can think about as social infrastructures, more from a built fabric point of view. So we didn't have the radio stations that you saw in Justin's thing, although at a neighborhood scale, interestingly, of course, you can have radio stations, even at a block scale, which is then interplaying with space or a spatial definition of a community. But here you see a bunch of other things you'll all recognize. And these can be reframed away from their traditional understanding. So I worked on this project in Brisbane, the State Library of Queensland, and clearly it's more than just a place that is shifting books in and out and users in and out. It's doing many, many, many things. Arguably the living room of the city, which is a much more open, fluid definition, harder to nail down and quantify, but you can qualify it. Or Ron Finley's work in Los Angeles, taking 26 Central Parks worth of space of vacant parking lots. And he's figured out you can grow 724 million tomato plants. So there's a lot of quantifying going on there. But interestingly, doing that in food deserts immediately makes it a social and political act at the same time. Its value is social and political, not just the number of tomatoes that he's producing, although that's also useful. Same things modifying car parks. The artist Linda Tegg's work in Stockholm. Linda's a Melbourne-based artist, but these kind of modular meadow systems growing out in car parks. Or Studio Sidiana's work a year later in the same car park, actually looking at creating a kind of a nest for the local ducks and bird life. How do we trade off these kind of multiple users of these spaces? This is cooperative housing in Zurich. And of course, it's doing lots of things in terms of social and cultural fabric, as well as all of its environmental benefits and housing benefits at the same time. Microgrids at the super local scale, like these ones in Perth, these are social infrastructures as much as their energy. This Care Blocks series in Bogota, one of the best projects I've seen recently. It's extraordinary, but super local, super spatial, but also playing things out in terms of care and politics again. Or finally, this cocktail bar in Sheffield in a former public toilet. It's called Public. And everything in this bar is made locally by local craftspeople. Every bit of crockery, the whiskey, everything all the way through. Even the soundtrack for the bar is by the Arctic Monkeys drummer. So it's kind of, I'd say it's almost like a Bottega, as in the showroom with the studio in the back. But here the studio is the Sheffield area. So this then finally brings this kind of question of the economic and political dynamics underneath those things. Those things take work and effort and a complete reframing of what they're about. So this is where the doughnut thinking comes into play. Mariana's work around missions, but I think equally Danny Dorling's work around slowdown is super interesting here, because he just points out what we're moving into in terms of demographics alone, just takes the engine of growth off the table. As far as we can tell, as far as he would put it anyway. Now, if we rethink that, re-gear ourselves to that different dynamic, that could be immensely beneficial. If we don't do that, we're looking at chaos and horror. But it's very interesting seeing how it's presented in the press at the minute. You know, the US or China is seen as a problem. This isn't necessarily a problem. It depends how we approach it. In Tokyo, it kind of shows you this. This is a funny graph from Dorling showing it's just slowed down to a halt in terms of population growth. And so what you find there is this kind of refining of itself in the same plot. And this is well understood in Japanese architecture, for instance, for a long time. This is the street as a transportation space, a private space, a community space, a plural nature with plural meaning, all simultaneously. The works of architects Lacaton and Vassal, who won the Pritzker Prize a couple of years ago, who have this now phrase, never demolish, and rework what's already there. That means kind of slowing down. And sometimes if they say doing nothing at all, equally valid architectural strategy. Dorling points out, perhaps we have more time to worry about this now, arguing that worrying is what humans do very well. So does the slowdown give us a glimpse of a possible future based on regenerative nature, all of those nice words that you see there? But it's understanding that those are distinctly social, cultural, and natural at the same time. And that means a reframing of the way we think these things, not just using, as Albright points out, 20th and 19th century models and pointing at these 21st century dynamics, but something completely different. So coming back to Justin's challenge in his paper, what does that look like? Well, we don't know, but this is where design can come in. Tim Christopherson points out that we don't know what a million hectares of reclaimed land looks like, actually, except I'm showing you in the background, that's a bit of China where that's exactly happened. But we do know what a 4-lane highway looks like. You know? So films like Wakanda, or Black Panther rather, with their vision of Wakanda, are actually really interesting because they give us a sense of what does a city look like with good public transport, I would argue. That's not what the film is ostensibly about, of course, but that's kind of what's going on there partly. Or Olaleka and Geographers' artworks about a kind of a rebuilt Brooklyn with this super regenerative biodiversity going rampant along with high technology. Or my colleague Rory Hyde's work based on Sunbury and Melbourne suburbs. What do these things layer into? What kind of new suburbs emerge from that? Or Julia Watson's work with Indigenous technologies and Indigenous communities. So the last point, these everyday infrastructures and technologies are cultural, social, spiritual, environmental, economic, all at the same time. Indigenous thinking, of course, is lot to teach us there from 60,000 years of doing that. And it enables us to see the environment in a different kind of way, the beauty and utility of things in our life around us. And this is the last point. So these kinds of things that I've talked about embody and engender the beauty and utility of shared things. And they're created for and by these cultural acts. And they're also infrastructural, but these infrastructures are about climate, health, and justice at the same time. That's a complete transformation of the way we approach them, but you can see how they could be bound together potentially. Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks, Dan. Yeah, that was great, and yeah, hopefully when we get the recording, we can dive deep into those quotes. Yeah,
I'm happy to send it around because I was racing through.
Yeah, great. So I'm going to pass over to Tully now, who's the director of Assemblage in at Flinders University. She's going to say a bit more about the donuts. You're going to dive deep into a donut.
I am, thanks. Great, excellent, thanks. So my name is Tully Barnett. I'm at Flinders University, and I'm just going to introduce myself and my work just very slightly because there's a bunch of things that I'm kind of bringing together here. So I've been working for a while on a research project called Laboratory Adelaide, The Value of Culture, which has been funded by a couple of different linkage grants that are about figuring out how to tell different stories about value, how to understand value differently, and how to communicate it. And it's been working with the cultural sector in order to do that work. But I'm also working with Justin on the Reset Arts and Culture project, and also working with the cultural sector in a bunch of different ways, including in arts and health projects and evaluation projects. But I also have a digital humanities component to me as well. So working with the Australasian Association for Digital Humanities and working on a DECRA that's around digitisation as a cultural practice, which is about thinking through, what digitisation means at the infrastructural level, really, cultural infrastructure. So in our work project, Laboratory Adelaide, we've been thinking about how different forms of reporting are sites for how we come to understand value. So that is, value might be conferred or decided upon in formal and informal reporting practices and processes. So we say a little bit of something about this in our book, What Matters, Talking Value in Australian Culture, Julian Merrick, Robert Fiddian and myself. And through this process, we were looking for different sorts of ideas that could illuminate aspects of this value conferral process. So we were reading Jane Gleason White's 6 Capitals, The Revolution Capitalism Has to Have, or Can Accountants Save the Planet? The last time I caught up with her, I think maybe the answer has tipped into no, but anyway, it's an interesting question. And then looking through different forms of sustainable reporting systems, processes, frameworks that might add space into traditional reporting practices for more than just money in, money out, red columns and black columns, etc. So as Justin said, there's been a move towards this idea of heterodox economics becoming more mainstream. And as people like Ayo Claimer, cultural economists, have said, something went wrong in economics education in the 80s. And I think we can all maybe have a guess about what it was that went wrong, but something went wrong and it's led us down a really dark path. And so working now, towards finding some of those, forms of visionary texts that are looking for those pressing problems that are facing the world at the moment, these new ideas, if not solutions that might be available to us to lead the way. And something from that has come from Kate Raworth's book, Doughnut Economics. She's been working on this idea for a while. She gave a TED talk in the first few years of the last decade, and then she's been building up that this concept of the donut. And so just to explain it for people who might not be familiar with donut economics, here are 2 rings. On the outer ring is the ecological ceiling, the space beyond which the planet cannot be pushed and survive. And then there's the inner ring of the donut, which is the social foundation, the space by which people, if they fall beyond that inner ring, fall into forms of poverty and injustice that are not sustainable for human beings. And so the trick is that we've got to figure out how to keep people inside the safe and just space, inside those two rings of the donut, in order to keep the planet safe, but also keep humans thriving. And so out of that donut philosophy, or that donut framework, Kate Raworth, in collaboration with other people, have come up with this idea of a city portrait methodology, which is about applying that donut economics approach to a city, to an individual city, in order to think through the individual characteristics. How might the donut and its framework appear or render in these different cities that all have different ways of being and different needs and different forms of expression and different populations, etc., different priorities and focuses, etc. And so here are the lenses of that city portrait methodology, social and ecological, global and local, asking some questions about what does it mean for people in this city to thrive, and so on. And also, how does this city connect up with the well-being of people internationally as well, and how do we value our local environment, natural habitats, but also how do we do that on a global scale as well? And so the city portrait methodology was piloted in Philadelphia, Portland, and Amsterdam, where Kate Raworth is currently working. And I want to point out that arts and culture are not entirely absent from that Amsterdam model. So we can see there a little notion of culture there in these many things. And if we look at that a little bit more closely, it's about citizens and visitors wanting a high quality, innovative and diverse cultural offering. And then Amsterdam children become acquainted with arts and culture. And then there was one example of that in the Amsterdam city model. But still, I think the story of how arts and culture have formed such a strong place in the Melbourne donut is a parable of value. It's a story about how arts and culture thrive in even when they're forgotten and left out. So the Melbourne donut was developed by the Regen Melbourne group, who identify themselves as a network of passionate individuals and organisations coming together to create a safe, just and prosperous future for our city. There was a project to workshop and create a donut using that city portrait methodology for Melbourne, and it was funded as a short-term project by the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, the City of Melbourne, and there were other contributors as well. And I'm very aware that there may be people who've been involved in this project here in this group, so that could be useful in discussion. Here's the Melbourne donut. So you can see that the Melbourne donut has the ecological ceiling, the social foundations, and it has a lot of very similar components to it as the original donut as envisaged by Kate Raworth and her people. But there is a few differences, a few nuances, and one of those is that appearance of art and culture, not just in a lower stream when things are kind of like nuanced out to very small particularities, but right here in the center of this donut, art and culture. And it's interesting for this discussion, it's interesting for the Melbourne donut and for donut economics more broadly, that it's called their art and culture, and I'll get a bit more to that in a moment. And so here's a little bit more detail about the Melbourne donut, but I'll leave you to look that up if you're interested in that more detail, because I want to make sure that we leave time for discussion. And so Kai Lofgren, who's been involved with that Melbourne Regen Melbourne donut process, has said that they really did want to add a few elements, and that one of those was that the health of our art and our culture is intrinsically linked to the health of our entire city. He said that that's what emerged out of this Melbourne donut city portrait workshop process that occurred over a series of months or even longer. He said that, you know, that they went back to those SDGs and that there was very little information about arts and culture in them, as Justin has pointed out. But they found that in their process that if we don't achieve a healthy art and culture in our city, then we cannot achieve a healthy city. And then he said that art and culture was referred to more than any other dimension throughout the workshops and interviews, and it became clear how linked those things were in the process. But how does art and culture appear in other well-being exercises or processes? So this is just a screen capture from my state, so Wellbeing SA, that they've developed their Wellbeing Index this year to monitor the well-being of South Australians over time. And art and culture are not here at all in any way, even if we kind of like abstract in any way whatsoever. They are in Aboriginal cultural well-being. And so I think there's something to learn on and reflect from there, and to think about how is it that we're talking about well-being in these, as we develop more intense, I guess, conversations around this notion of well-being. We're heading into potentially a well-being federal budget in the coming time. What does it mean that arts and culture do not appear in much of our discussions about what well-being means? And so there's something here, I think, to just briefly to hark back to what Justin was saying about the foundational economy work and his work in the foundational economy and how it relates to arts and culture in the working paper. It's not just about adding those cultural measures alongside economic and social ones. We need to challenge the policy language around economy itself. Right. And so framing within those public policy goals of well-being, social justice and sustainability. Right. So that's the challenge that is ahead for us now. And again, I'm just very briefly going to draw attention to Mariana Mazzucato's work around value, where she's actually saying, in alignment with what my colleagues have said in our book, What Matters, Talking Value in Australian Culture, that the whole notion of value has been abstracted and needs to be re-enthused. I think we need a kind of regen value project to go back to the ground level on this notion of value and draw it up so that it is fit for purpose for a world that is going to need us to make difficult decisions and work for keeping society inside of that donut. So to conclude, I think that our conceptual architecture for value needs work. We need to be thinking about that notion that Dan described of infrastructure as foundations. We're going through a cultural policy process in Australia at the moment. And so what new ways of thinking, new tools will we need in order to hold back those trash compactors of that are moving in towards us, that we find ourselves in now, where art and culture may have been central to how we understood our experience as humans in lockdown, in the pandemic, but are now once again being left out of all of our processes and all of our understandings and definitions of well-being. So we've got some tools that we can use in order to change that, which we have to now grab and go forward with. Thanks.
Thanks, Tully. We've got a few minutes for questions, and if anybody's got anything to say or comment, I'll have a look at the chat board.
There's one there, just in Myra. Myra's put her hand up.
Okay, go on then, Myra. I can't see that for some reason, but
hi. Thank you for the fantastic presentations. So my question is for the whole panel. I just wondered if you could say a bit more about the wellbeing federal budget, given that the Treasurer is intending to change measurements he's intended to go beyond the GDP measurements to measure well-being, and I just wondered if your work would be contributing to that.
Anne, did you want to say that, or Tully?
Well, just to say that, we don't really know, we don't have much information yet about what that wellbeing budget is going to look like, or yes, if it will eventuate. There are models around the world that are available for looking, into getting some kind of a clue. We just don't know where art and culture are going to fit in that discussion, although if it was to learn from exercises around the world, it will need to do so. Does anybody have any more insight there?
I would, not specifically about the budget, the federal budget. My caution would be, while it sounds like a good thing, and let's push that forward. The challenge is probably one that I would see more beneficial at a local scale, and I worry that we load too much into the federal level. The further we get away from the ground, from the street, from neighborhoods, from places and cities, the harder it is, I think, to construct these kind of foundational or sometimes called upstream kind of policies that generate different types of value in an everyday sense for people. So the work that I did in Sweden was very much able to take place because you pay your income tax to the local municipality, not to the federal government. And so the local municipalities are meaningful actors in people's lives. And likewise, the regional government, the state level. And so a lot of funding and activity and organization is at that scale in the system. And that leaves the national government with a different kind of agenda. In Australia, we have it the other way round. But I don't think that is going to help us in the long run. So I'd rather have the wellbeing conversation up and down those scales of government, not trying to assume that the feds will come in with some silver bullet that will suddenly change everything on the ground. They're too far away from the action, I think, at that scale.
Yeah, and I'm not across the detail of that. I just know, I mean, following Jane Gleeson White's book that Tully mentioned, the problem with the addition of different indicators, and they're fine, you not just the economic, but the other stuff, is that economics trumps all often. It seems like quadruple or quintuple bottom line, but in fact there's one real bottom line that we all know, which is the economy. So that's, I'm a bit cynical about that. Art and culture, I don't think are anywhere there, and I think it was there in the Melbourne, it's interesting that was defining health. So I know it was healthy art and culture. Does that mean that it's rich and vibrant and doing all the things it should be doing, or does it mean it contributes to our health? And I think that those are the things we still haven't sorted out. How to describe the role of art and culture, the contribution of art and culture outside of health or economy or social connection. Actually, it does things for itself. So we don't have that language at the moment. Well-being might help us along the way, but yeah, I'll wait for that to happen.
I mean, I agree that well-being may or may not help us along the way, but I think if arts and culture aren't in that conversation at that state government level in their well-being framework and index, then that's a problem.
Yes.
So it might not be a solution, but we can't be out of the table, No,
exactly. That's right. And that's one of the things that I mentioned, Hans Momas from the Netherlands. He was saying that they're just not at the table, and he meant actually quite literally. They sit around tables, and the cultural sector is not present. So yeah,
no, absolutely. And from the last 3 years I've spent working in the Swedish government, and that's similar. It's it's ghettoized in a sense in that way, and that's in a well-funded welfare state model with a strong arts and cultural sector, but it's still separated from any questions of the economy or the energy systems or healthcare. So I think there's definitely a case to be made for the connection between, let's say, arts and culture and things like well-being, but then equally you'd want that sort of loosely coupled or not too instrumental, knowing there's also a lot of value in arts and culture which is nothing to do with well-being in a sense, or might even be detrimental to well-being, but positive value from arts and culture point of view. Very complex to not to get too instrumental about it.
yeah, I agree with that as well. But also, I think well-being is probably a better way of thinking about what arts and culture contribute than, say, the happiness index, right? Because you know, I think you can have space for valuing failure in arts and culture inside a well-being framework that's a bit more able to deal with discomforting art, for example.
Okay. Was there anybody else out there on either text or funny little orange hand thing? Right. Well, I'll take that silence for assent.
Yeah, exactly. I think everybody's agreed with every single word that the three of us have said, and exactly, resounding.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's good. Do you want to say some more last words before we clock off?
There's one thing that, like I said, I'm happy to. I know I blitzed through a bunch of quotes there, so I'm happy to share slides. I guess you guys are too, which would be great, so we can get the references shared and things. But one thing I didn't make the cut was another Eno reference. So sorry for about 4 or 5 Eno references in my talk, but one was the value of arts and culture as another of his ideas as a kind of simulator of possible worlds, which I quite like as well. A different kind of value that arts and culture can be used in prototyping these kinds of environments. He talks about how you can experience a threatening film or TV show. And it puts you in another place and you understand a set of possibilities, but you know also that the TV show or the art gallery is something you can walk out of or you can turn off at some point. So that's, I suppose, what we were also trying to get into the policy making framework there. You could see art and culture as a way of experimenting with everyday life in public, around which you could generate insights, but also people get a chance to understand and on their own terms these alternatives in front of us, which is that seems that is entirely absent from policymaking so far I've seen in Australia, that deploying arts and culture in that way. I don't know if that triggers any thoughts in you two at all.
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, I do think we're at a particular point, as I've kind of tried to make the point. We are at a particular moment, and I think culture is in a pretty bad way in Australia, and each country has its own issues. I don't think we've been particularly impacted by creative economy and creative industries discourse too much, simply because the last government was so idiotically wedded to resources, unlike this one, of course, that the creative economy was neither here nor there, not interested in those kind of things. So we've been less impacted by that. But I think the level at which the level of respect for art and culture was at a really low point, and obviously the new government has got a different approach to that. But and we've all been making submissions to the cultural policy process. But I do feel that we've got a long way to catch up, even to the global debates that are going on actually, and the sooner we kind of raise our head out of the isolation that this country's been in, certainly for 2 or 3 years, and perhaps longer given the last government, I do think we're ready for a real sea change in how we view art and culture. But if we wed ourselves to that economic language, I think we're in some trouble. And I commented on, I know Rory Hyde wrote some interesting things about the Green Line over the weekend, and its reduction to value. And one of the biggest aspects of the cultural policy, the national cultural policy, is that, to me, the dissonance between their embrace of First Nations and the celebration of the culture and is absolutely rooted in their communities, as we saw the well-being index that Tully mentioned. And yet we then immediately turn around and start saying, well, it's worth 4.2 billion, blah blah blah. And actually, that's as much a challenge as the reconciliation process and those kind of questions. That if we are reconciled, what kind of culture do we have to then become? So that's my...
No, absolutely. That would be very interesting to think about. If it's worth that much money, then how much of that is going to First Nations peoples would be just a very interesting challenge to that accountancy work. But then also it's the lack of qualitative assessment there. You know, it talks about generating 4,000 jobs, but like good jobs, bad jobs, like polluting jobs or non-polluting jobs. I mean, there's just no sense of what that, you know, bullshit jobs, as Graeber would say, or well-paid, you know, secure employment. Absolutely absent from that discussion. It's just 4,000 jobs. It could be entirely detrimental, but it's never presented as such. So, yeah.
Okay.
More information can be found on the Reset website. Go head over there. You can see our manifesto that's not a manifesto. Justin's working paper is there for download. Our contribution to the cultural policy submissions consultation process is there.
Great. Well, on that sponsorship note, thanks for everybody who's turned up on a Monday night, and thanks obviously to the two panelists there, Tully and Dan, and we'll see you in other formats, in other spaces in the fullness of time. Thank you, and good night.